Okay, just wait for some more people to join and we'll get started. Give us about 15 seconds. And if people want to chat in where they are, that's great. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Okay, we'll get started now. Thank you for joining us, everyone. My name's Sally Ashworth. I'm head of media for Harvard Business Review Press here in London. And today I'm very pleased to welcome Christian Schuh and Wolfgang Schnellbächer. Christian is senior partner and managing director at Boston Consulting Group based in Vienna. He's led purchasing and procurement projects across automotive and tech for companies in Europe, North America and Asia. And he's well known for the book The Purchasing Chessboard, and his YouTube channel, Procurement in the Park, which we'll share a link to that later. Wolfgang is partner and managing director for BCG in Stuttgart, where he leads BCG's procurement activities in Europe and advises global leaders in industrial and consumer goods. Together with Alenka, Triplat and Daniel Weise, they are the authors of the new book, Profit from the Source. In an extraordinarily difficult time for business, with supply chain disruptions, inflation on the rise, and the growing energy crisis, we suddenly find ourselves reassessing the long undervalued function of procurement and supplier management. In today's discussion, Christian and Wolfgang will explain why this is such an important corporate capability, and they will outline practical steps we can all take to put suppliers at the heart of our businesses, to develop the procurement function and exploit its full potential. I'll hand over to our presenters in a second. Just quickly, the usual formalities. We will be online for an hour and Wolfgang and Christian will outline some key ideas from the book. Then we'll have time for a couple of questions. Please type any questions that you have for our presenters into the Q&A box and share your comments in the chat as you're doing already. Thank you. Our colleague John's on hand for technical problems. Use chat if you need his help. And finally, we're recording this event and we'll share a link to everybody via email after the session. Okay, thank you very much. Christian, Wolfgang, over to you.
Thank you, Sal, for the opportunity to present our book in this forum. So let us start with introducing ourselves. So I'm Christian Schuh. So I've been a supply chain consultant for 27 years now. Of these 27 years, I spent the first 15 years working for car makers all over the world, always at the interface of procurement and engineering. And from 2010 to 2018, I mostly worked in the high-tech industry for clients like Dell in Austin and Foxconn in Taiwan. And since late 2018, I'm back in automotive working for European car makers and helping them manage the various supply chain crises. Wolfgang?
Yeah, my name is Wolfgang Schnellbächer, and I'm working on procurement for 13 years. And what's most fascinating me is that the first 10 years in that were very much looking the same. We were always talking about should costing, we were always talking about low-cost country sourcing, and always with the cost improvement angle. Now, the last 3 years, two major things have changed. Number one, that we have a much wider value proposition we as procurement can contribute to our companies. So it's no more just savings, it's quality, innovation, sustainability, speed, the prevention of risk. And in that, we get much closer to the original company strategy. And number two, based on the fact that we can leverage digital and AI so strongly, we can actually fulfill this value promise. So we have the technology now to go bionic and to really have a much, much wider value scope.
Okay, so before we dive deeper into the content, and maybe you will stay on this slide for a second. So a couple of stats. So 2 years ago, we pitched this book to the 12 leading US publishers, and we got 7 offers. And at least, as I know, and Sally may correct me, I think this is a pretty good ratio. And we went for the publisher who we thought fits best to our values, so Harvard Business Review Press. And there are 2 firsts here as well. So Profit from the Source is Boston Consulting Group's very first book on operations. And Profit from the Source is also HBR's very first book on procurement. So if okay with you, let's jump into the content on the next slide. So for the past 50 years, so companies have been on a single-minded mission to achieve growth by lowering costs. And to a large extent, globalization has been both an enabler and a result of this mission. And maybe the most visible example for this is the creation of an extended just-in-time supply chain that wraps itself around the world. So Thomas Friedman from the New York Times was not wrong when he praised the global supply chain as one of the wonders of the modern world. But as we know, globalization is going into reverse. So the clearest signs of this have been the current global supply chain crisis. So we are seeing evidence of this in our professional lives and in our personal lives. So Daniel, one of our co-authors, he has been trying to buy an electric car for some time, and he's still on the end of a long waiting list because the car maker is struggling to get the required semiconductors. And it's the same with consumer goods. So the PlayStation or the Xbox, some of you, I'm sure, have ordered for your kids, takes ages to arrive. So globalization going into reverse, so the economist calls this globalization, so I should have practiced this word ahead. So it started a few years ago. And one trigger here was the trade war between the United States and China, another the COVID pandemic, and now we have this conflict in Ukraine. And at least in the group of authors, so we have no expectation that we will get back to a kind of pre-crisis normal anytime soon, if ever. Nor can we yet talk about a new normal, so a phase of consistent, predictable economic activity, quite in contrary. So we believe normal appears to be over. So let's look at how we relate to these challenges in the book on the next slide. So we think that the current global supply chain crisis really vindicate our focus on suppliers and on supply chains. But of course, we started work on profit from the source long before the current crisis and the global pandemic. Now, talking about the content, I would say that the book is pretty balanced between offense and defense, in a sports terminology. So offense would be topics like leveraging supply innovation to create more attractive products that customers will be excited about. And defense would be topics like working with suppliers to ensure continuity of supply in times of crisis. So given the current environment, the latter clearly is very timely, and I hope that it prompts even more people to read the book. But we should not forget about the format. There's so much where suppliers can help you gain a competitive advantage. So let's put this into context on the next slide. So when asked what good looks like in procurement, in working with suppliers, we like to use the framework shown here. So on the horizontal axis is focus. So it ranges from pure cost reduction focus on the left to a focus on profitable growth on the right. Profitable growth may sound like cost reduction, but it is something entirely different. So profitable growth in this case means that procurement ensures that the company offers the right product with the right innovation from the right supplier. Now on the vertical axis of the graph is mandate. It ranges from supporting the corporate strategy on the bottom to shaping the corporate strategy on the top. Shaping the corporate strategy gives procurement the opportunity to get involved in every critical stage of a product's evolution. So now notice what's on the upper right side. So we have some of the best known tech companies. And at the very top is Apple. Apple was almost bankrupt in the late 1990s before it was rescued by two people. So one was Steve Jobs, a product marketing genius. So he figured out which products customers would get excited about 3 years into the future. The other was Tim Cook, a procurement and supply chain genius. So he figured out which suppliers were the most innovative and could make the innovations at scale. So Jobs and Cook joined forces to develop a product roadmap and then gave engineering the job of implementing it. So some would argue that Apple can have such an extravagant approach because they are the world's richest company. I would argue that Apple is the world's richest company because it allows procurement to shape the corporate strategy and then tasks it with driving profitable growth. The contrast to automakers and traditional companies in general could not be starker. They see success in procurement mainly through cost savings and supporting the corporate strategy. So let's dive a bit deeper into the differences between cost savings and profitable growth on the next slide. What is the size of the price for companies on the top right of this framework? What is it that turned Apple into a multi-trillion-dollar company? In our view, besides cost savings, it's 5 benefits. A key benefit is risk reduction. So in 2021, the global automotive industry lost 10 million cars to the shortage of semiconductors. We know that those very, very few car makers that truly focus on suppliers shipped all the cars they had planned for and as a result gained market share. And while doing this, these very few companies made breakthroughs in carbon emission reduction, and they prepared to launch a new generation of vehicles with cutting edge technology. And all of this, while their competitors who were largely ignoring suppliers and taking everything for granted were virtually paralyzed. So let's take a look at what needs to happen on the next slide. So we would like to be able to say that CEOs only need to take some modest steps, make a few tweaks here and there, take a bit more notice of the suppliers, give a few more resources to the procurement function and done. Unfortunately, we don't think CEOs will solve their problems if they just do this. For this reason, we have developed a blueprint for radical transformation of a company with 3 key building blocks. So how the company needs to change, how the CEO needs to change, how the company needs to change, and how the company's supplier ecosystem needs to change. So let's look into these in detail. First, so the CEO needs to put suppliers at the heart of the business and empower the procurement function. If they do this, they can expect to leap ahead of their rivals. The second building block relates to the whole company. So here we have 3 broad recommendations. The company needs to treat as friends the top suppliers. So these are the 20 to 40 who account for typically half of the procurement budget today, and those who will be even more important tomorrow. Second, the procurement team put the procurement team at the heart of the product life cycle. So right now, procurement gets involved after the design is essentially frozen. So this is too late to have meaningful impact on the cost, quality, and sustainability of a product. Third, create what we call a bionic procurement function that blends the power of AI with the power of human ingenuity, creativity, judgment, curiosity, and intuition. And then the third bullet, the third building block on the outer ring relates to the company's network of suppliers. So the appetite for change here very much depends on the context of the industry, the specific company, and the economic environment. With suppliers, you can optimize along 6 vectors. So cost, innovation, quality, sustainability, speed, and risk. Of course, one may argue that you need all of this at the same time, but realistically, you will need to prioritize, and every company will chart its own journey. Okay, so let's start with how the CEO needs to change on the next slide. So every single aspect that we are recommending in profit from the source has already been deployed by a company. But to be clear, no single company has deployed everything we are recommending, but everything we are recommending has been deployed by companies. Probably the single company coming closest to what we are recommending is Apple. And let's take a look at this through the lens of maker, suppliers, and procurement leadership imperatives on the next slide. You know, for us end customers, Apple is a marketing company that churns out one cool product after another. But in the tech industry, Apple is known for being a supply chain company, or maybe the supply chain company. Nobody else is running such a tight ship, and nobody else can produce a complex product like the iPhone at this scale. And nobody made it through the semiconductor crisis better than Apple. A key reason for this is the fact that Tim Cook was Chief Procurement Officer before he became CEO. And you see this supply chain focus everywhere at Apple. And it was instrumental for them becoming a multi-trillion-dollar company. Now, you may say that with the example of Apple and Tim Cook in mind, CEOs across all industries are surely focusing on suppliers, right? Well, the answer is on the next slide. Far from it. Indeed, in some striking research published by Harvard Business School, CEOs spend just 1% of their time with suppliers. 1% translates into 7 minutes per working day. And we think that CEOs are making a big mistake. As you see on the left of the slide, an average company spends more than 50% of their budget on suppliers. So CEOs are in fact not paying attention to half of their cost base. But as the past 24 months have taught us, this is not just the cost problem. I already talked about cars, PlayStations, and Xboxes not being shipped. And the customers of all of these cars and other products increasingly care about carbon emissions. And as you know, the suppliers and the supply chains account for the majority of the carbon emissions associated with these products. So how are CEOs going to meet their publicly proclaimed reduction targets without talking to suppliers? Well, and CEOs are also gambling the future, so especially when it comes to electronics. The competence typically is not within companies, but out there with suppliers. So the competitiveness of future product very much depends on how well a company can harness the innovations of suppliers. So that's how the CEOs needs to change. Wolfgang, do you want to take a look at this from the perspective of the company?
Exactly. So if we jump to the next slide, we see that the change of the CEO only is the nucleus. So it's the core center, but there's more outside of this core center which needs to change. And the next step is, of course, the company. The entire company needs to change and become more supplier-centric and more supplier-focused. And rule number 1 will be to treat suppliers as friends. If we jump to the next slide, we see one core example. In 2002, Elon Musk was founding SpaceX. And SpaceX has actually been seen in the overall world of the spaceship industry of NASA and the American fields who have been working here as a rather threat and not really as something to take serious. Yeah. So this is nothing that will help us. Yeah. This will maybe be some image damage because it might fail. And this is nothing we can embed into our overall system setup. Now, SpaceX and NASA are collaborating very closely. For example, when it comes to transport, for example, when it comes to joint missions to the moon. Now, NASA is treating the entire ecosystem, is treating SpaceX more as an ally. And this is how we want companies to see the overall supplier ecosystem, that you need to treat suppliers as friends, not as something where there's a boundary, but as a core enabler for new joint ideas, as a core enabler for joint idea generation. If we jump to the next slide, we see an example from the consumer industry. Maybe you're familiar with the brand of Red Bull. Red Bull is one of the most famous energy drinks and soft drinks. And actually, a lot of the innovation that went into it, a lot of the quality control came from one of the core suppliers, which is Rauch, an Austrian-based company. And actually, the founder of Red Bull and the owner of Rauch, they're very closely interlinked. They very much share joint discussions, and they both openly communicate that a lot of the innovation that went into Red Bull and a lot into the market now, big revolution that Red Bull brought into it, was actually brought back to Rauch ideas. And just to give you another example, when we look at the biggest threat that went over us with the big COVID crisis, again, companies were not trying to develop the vaccine themselves, but they went to suppliers. So Pfizer, for example, they did not invent the vaccine themselves, but they looked into a supplier ecosystem, and with that found the fastest solution through BioNTech. And both companies have been profiting tremendously, and the whole mankind has been profiting, right? So these are just 3 examples of the fact that if you treat suppliers right, if you find the right suppliers, then in your overall ecosystem, you will win majorly in the overall market setup. Now, of course, not every supplier is alike. And of course, not every supplier should be treated alike. If we look at the next slide, we see a differentiation mechanism on which suppliers to invest into and which suppliers then rather to harvest and then rather to mitigate. And in the end, it's 2 dimensions we look at. Number 1, the supplier's performance. So how well is supplier performing the overall quality needs, the overall innovation push, etc. today. And number 2, strategic potential now of each one of these suppliers. And if both things come together, then of course we have found core suppliers where we need to drive this very close integration, where we are then to work jointly on new setups. Now, it's very crucial we don't limit this at existing suppliers. Just think about it. How much innovation, how much sustainability potential, how many ideas are out there if we expand the supplier focus from the existing ones to the ones which are not yet in the direct ecosystem. So it's important the overall company cluster suppliers into such a schema, and in that always looks out for new ideas and new suppliers out there. And maybe just one more thought about this before we go on. If we just think about the field of innovation, and if we just think about how many engineers a particular company has, let's just take an automotive company, maybe of a medium size, maybe having 10,000, 20,000 engineers. Only the top 10 suppliers very likely will have close to 100,000 engineers. Not to mention all the engineers which are out there in potential supplying companies. So it's crucial to treat suppliers as friends to ensure all these ideas out there will become part of the overall development, be it in pharma, be it in very technical things like we've seen with NASA and SpaceX, or be it also in consumer goods like we've seen with Red Bull and Rauch. Now, how then to do it? If we look at the next slide, we need to be close to these suppliers, and we need to ensure that the suppliers we want to have a close integration with, there's a formalized way of sharing ideas, of having a joint mission, and in that having a very close collaboration. Coming back to the Pfizer-BioNTech example, there was no flights almost in the heights of COVID, but there were very regular flight exchanges between the 2 companies, BioNTech and Pfizer, where the developers are working very closely with super structured interactions, super structured information sharing, and an upfront knowledge basis towards a very clear mission. And where we want to go to, after having identified which suppliers to treat as friends, after having identified where to work closely with, we need to come to such a setup of regular interaction points, of a regular inter-exchange, and in the end, of a close relationship, which in the end is the core of any friendship. Now, this was just number 1. of how the company needs to change. If we jump to the next slide, we see that the procurement team needs to be empowered as well. We just talked about how to get innovation better in, how to get quality better in, how to overall succeed in a faster and more innovative product development of our own. Well, the first and natural thing we need to do, if we go to the next slide, we need to ensure that all the ideas from the market are in and the CPO and the procurement team are enabled. I don't know how much you guys are James Bond fans, but if you watch it, in the moment James Bond is walking with Q, he's completely giving himself into the hands of what Q has been bringing in. So he's no more trying to control this, he's just taking the ideas and in that then leveraging for his own strong good. Now, something similar companies need to do with opening themselves to all the ideas coming from the market early on in the life cycle. And this is what we see on the next page. We need to come out of the situation where we as a company try to think out everything ourselves with our limited engineering capacity. And then at one point in time, hand over finished paperwork to procurement and outsource exactly this from the market. We need to be smarter. And again, high tech and Apple are great examples here. We need to bring in the ideas from the market early on into the process, and by that, give procurement the mandate to share with us these ideas, to gather the ideas in the market from the existing, from new suppliers, to build up incentive schemes what suppliers get back if they share these ideas up front. One example, we were completely stuck with one of the large German automotive OEMs on further reducing cost early in the product life cycle. And it was very clear that tendering will no more bring us these cost effects. But by just bringing in the supplier ideas up front, we were amazed by how many creativity and how many smartness there was flowing into the process of things we were not having thought of before. In that, we shall not forget rigidity. And this is again something we can learn from high tech, where there's more profiting from the source, what we see on the next page. Rigidity in the sense that typically you have new features coming in, you have new complexity coming in. And there's a golden rule for everything that's coming in. We need to find an idea to replicate the cost very clearly and to ensure we don't have a cost creep in. And that's actually incentivizing our own organization to again scan the market, to again look at procurement. What can we do to find out further ideas jointly to reduce the cost then on the other side? So every new feature, be it a camera, be it a stronger material design, be it maybe a more smooth handling, there needs to be a counter idea coming in, and therefore again, procurement is raised up by asking the suppliers more. If we go to the next page, we look at the third dimension. We need to go bionic. We need to ensure our procurement function is lean and mean and having the ability to really strike based on strong data setups. And that means in particular, the roles need to change. So if we try to look at the next slide, we see that procurement is coming, and you can even jump more, to a more complex role setup. In the past, we were treating procurement as a very operational force, and you see it with all these green heads who are just rolling off POs late on in the process. But if we want to be smart and bring in new innovation and ideas, if we want to bring in sustainability ideas, for example, we want to assess the risks right to do the defense move that Christian just laid out. We need to have AI programmers in procurement who guide us to make the right data choices. We need master data specialists to collect the information right in order to give the AI programmers the power to do so. We need robotic maintenance engineers who build up bots who are taking on the very operational tasks from the operational teams. And maybe we also need to sort out our procurement strategists in a new form and manner. So there's a new vision there, and in a more empowered procurement function, a wider set of roles, more educated, more data-driven, in order to make the right choices. And then we can bring in a great tool set, what we see on the next slide, a great tool set of solutions out there. And again, the profit from the source, the supplier-based focus comes in. So we were just collecting 120 solutions only in procurement, finding out the most sustainable supplier, finding out the most innovative supplier, ensuring savings get directly hit into budgets, ensuring an automated tailspend negotiation is happening. There's numerous solutions out there, and in this Go Bionic function, we can ensure that our procurement function is always having the right setup of the tools there in order to then really enable us to get the innovation, the smartness from the market in.
Okay. So, and this brings us to the third building block, or the outer shell of our framework. And we have picked 3 of the 6 recommendations in this outer shell for deeper discussion. So right now we're focusing on number 6, so achieving breakthrough innovation. And here we will see that technology competence trumps procurement competence. So innovation will move from inside out to outside in order to benefit from this. Procurement needs to become more technology savvy. So, okay, let's once again look at Apple on the next slide. So like most other tech OEMs, Apple used chips from industry standard suppliers for a long time. So 10 years ago, with the introduction of the 2nd generation iPad, they introduced the first custom silicon, the A4 processor. And after dabbling with TSMC and Samsung for a while, they are now firmly in bed with Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And this partnership enables Apple to have industry-leading chips that have higher performance and lower power consumption than anything the industry standard suppliers offer. And TSMC has made so much money from the relationship with Apple that last year they invested $44 billion in CapEx, in equipment, and their manufacturing technology is absolutely top of the world. So they are the first ones to have 5 nanometer technology, will be the first to make the jump to 3 nanometer. And now even Intel is subcontracting CPUs to TSMC. So both parties benefit from this nearly exclusive partnership. So now let's look at what makes Apple's procurement tick on the next slide. So the interesting thing about Apple's procurement is that they're not necessarily better in procurement than the procurement at traditional industry companies. What differentiates them is technology competence, deep technology competence. Steel is a good example. For Apple, steel is a fairly new material. So they only started using steel for the chassis of the Apple Watch in 2015. And before anyone engaged in steel, procurement nominated a directly responsible individual for steel. And this DRI was tasked with knowing everything about steel. This included the raw materials needed to make steel, the production processes and the steel grades. The DRI needed to know all major steel makers in the world and the key people there. The DRI reached out to users of high-end steel, for example, makers of surgical instruments, and they even went to a small town in Austria to see makers of cutting tools. So with this deep technology competence, Apple's procurement automatically has a seat at the table with engineering. So no engineer at Apple would dare to launch a project without consulting procurement first. But then on the next slide, we need to ask ourselves, is all of this done by procurement people traveling the world? Or in other words, where should procurement be located? And where are the interesting suppliers headquartered? So we prepared this slide for a European car maker. And as usual in the automotive industry, their procurement hubs are next to the big factories. And this may have been perfectly fine in an era dominated by internal combustion engines. But today, with most of the innovation coming from electrics and electronics, it looks badly outdated. Their relevant suppliers mostly sit in Asia and North America, where the car maker hardly has any procurement presence. So compare this to the tech industry, where Apple and Dell have their main procurement hubs in Taipei, Shanghai, and Singapore. And this is where the key innovation partners have their headquarters. So Wolfgang, do you want to talk about sustainability?
Yes, happy to do so. We've just been at the global BCG partner meeting, and there was one phrase that stuck to my mind. If we don't fix sustainability in the next time period, there will be a point where people will start to panic, yeah, where we see more floods coming up, more natural disasters coming up, the global warming is gaining at an unprecedented speed, and only 1/3 of the companies of the markets with the world market cap have clear sustainability targets. So there will be major movements needed in the sustainability field as well. And again, surprise, surprise, if we jump to the next slide, sustainability is only to be tackled at your suppliers. If a company wants to go to net zero, if a company wants to do a major contribution, it's very, very hard to achieve it from your own operations. It has to come from your supplier base. Even if you're a raw material producer, but even more so if you're a finished goods producer, which we see on the next slide. So there you see different industries where the CO2 footprint lies. And in the end, the yellow, what you see there, means it's coming from your suppliers. And unless you're in the cement industry, where still 6% are coming from your supply base, a major share, especially in the end product manufacturers, electronics, construction, automotive, food, fashion, FMCG, major shares are coming from the suppliers. And therefore, sustainability as one of our biggest challenges we face as the overall economy, again, only can be tackled if you're profiting from the source, right? And if you're really treating your suppliers in a manner we just laid out. Now, what does it mean in particular? If we go to the next slide, we see that there's no excuse to just say, well, this is too expensive and we can only move it to the pricing. If you're leveraging your suppliers right, for example, for an average automotive, it's only 500 euros in the price increase. For an average pair of jeans, it's only €1 increase, yeah? If you look at the shopping basket, right, it's again, only 4% as a price increase. And so forth, yeah, construction, electronics. So it is possible to get there, right? It's no more just words, but you need to tackle the suppliers again, and you need to again make procurement a leadership imperative. If you don't put procurement as a centerpiece, as we've just seen with these yellow fields, you will not succeed in getting there, and your competitors will be able to capture these effects, have a clearer market stand, will not be penalized by governments, and you will just be lagging behind because they've been leveraging procurement right. Now, if we go to the next slide, we briefly see how these things are done. If you are driving now CO2 emissions and the reduction of it into your supply chain, then it's number one, the step is creating that transparency and very ambitious targets within different suppliers. So by now, there's digital solutions which it can tell you on specifics of each one of your suppliers, depending on their industry, their location, depending on their individual maturity, how big their CO2 emission is. And then you can set very clear targets in order to bring them down. Of course, then it's also about our own footprint, which ideally is to be set in conjunction with the suppliers. And then also design features where, again, we can profit a lot from suppliers' ideas, which can tell you not only on the cost reduction angle, what's more profitable, but also on the sustainability angle, what's more effective. And again, we're coming back to the engagement of a close collaboration, treating suppliers as friends, identifying them, of course, based on data where we can now get the best ideas and then jointly build these CO2 roadmaps, as we've seen in leading industry already happening, for example, the consumer industry, and now more and more industries follow, like the automotive industry. So sustainability, again, a great example how suppliers are the core parameter to get a core change, and at the same time how close collaborations treating suppliers as friends plays a role, and also how AI and data setups play a role by identifying the CO2 footprint of different supplier setups.
Okay, so halve your risks. So let me share an observation from a car maker, a typical car maker. from the beginning of the semiconductor crisis in January last year, 2021. So the car maker would mostly fly blind. They would not know which semiconductors they had in the cars. They did not know the vendors making the semiconductors, and they basically had zero relationship to these vendors. And most other car makers were in a similar situation. As a result, in 2021, the global automotive industry lost the 10 million cars that we already talked about. And it is getting worse, not better. So this year, the production losses are even greater than the same period last year. Could this have been avoided? Let's dive deeper on the next slide. So about 15 years ago, the idea of black swans became fashionable. And while it has its merits, it has become something of a lazy excuse. All this talk about black swans that are impossible to predict has distracted us from looking out for gray rhinos charging in our direction. So let me give you a real, almost real-time example. So the recent lockdowns in China that were hurting many industries, including Apple. So one of my current clients is a German car maker, and we are helping them in supply chain risk management. And in one of our routine connecting the dot sessions in early January, we looked at China. And what we saw was a zero COVID policy, domestic vaccines that are okay-ish, but also not super effective, an underwhelming vaccination rate, especially among elderly people, and the highly infectious Omicron variant. So for us, it was absolutely certain that within a couple of months, several regions in China would go into lockdown. So we systematically stocked up on components with high exposure to China. Does this completely protect us from the fallout of the lockdowns? No, but we are doing much better than our competitors. And mind you, we don't have a crystal ball. All we did is get together once a month for connecting the dot sessions and apply some logical thinking. And sometimes you don't even have to do that. It may be sufficient just to talk to people and or analyze data. So let's look at this on the next slide. So here's a question. Why did it take car makers 7 months to recognize that there's a semiconductor crisis? Dell and the other PC makers have been in crisis mode since May 2020, or latest June 2020. Car makers noticed that something was going off track in December 2020 or January 2021. 7 months. Imagine what a car maker could have achieved in the 7 months had they simply talked to a PC maker. Or imagine what they could have achieved with a market model like the one you see here. So the red line shows you the highly seasonal demand. So seasonality is driven by back to school in August, the smartphone season that starts in September, Black Friday, Christmas, and Chinese New Year. So historically, we had supply exceeding demand between February and August, but this is over now. So the gray line shows you production capacity for semiconductors. So it's growing steadily, but in 2020, growth was a little bit less than planned, and this was caused by safety and health measures at the construction sites. So with the beginning of the pandemic, we had unprecedented demand that was driven by homeschooling, home office, the 5G rollout, and the associated cloud services. And it was further boosted by the stimulus packages with consumers not being able to spend money on experiences like going on vacation, instead spending on products. And at the bottom, we have the annual sum. So in 2020, demand exceeded supply by just 1 percentage point, and that already caused huge disruptions. But in 2021 and this year, the gap was and will be even greater than in 2020. And we can expect the current crisis to continue at least into 2023. So if we jump to the next slide, I would like to conclude this chapter on risk and supply chain risk management with a bit of a personal story. So this is my third semiconductor crisis. So the first one in 2011 got me into the PC industry. So while searching for a solution, a PC maker found a book, so the purchasing chess, but Sal mentioned that before, that I had written. In 2017 and 2018, we helped the same PC maker mitigate a semiconductor shortage that was not as severe as the one we're experiencing now. So then it felt a little bit like this fable of the hare and the tortoise. Wherever we went, Apple had already been there. They had excellent contacts to the boardrooms of all the relevant makers of semiconductors. And for example, they had their own part numbers, which shielded them from activities like fair share among customers. So for the PC maker, this served as a major wake-up call, and they vowed that this will never happen to them again. And in the current semiconductor crisis, they're doing much better than their competitors. And if you look at the automotive industry, you can pretty much correlate the speed at which OEMs are learning, car makers are learning from the tech industry to how well they are getting through this crisis. Some were learning fast last year, and they pretty much built the cars they had planned to build with, while everyone else lost 10, 20, even 30% of the cars. And this leads us to one key recommendation for supply chain risk management. You need to intimately know your suppliers. You need to intimately know the suppliers of your suppliers, and you need to intimately know the suppliers of those suppliers. So Wolfgang, do you want to wrap it up?
Yes, very happy to do so. So what we hope we brought across is excitement for the topic of procurement, which in the end is an excitement for human collaboration, an excitement to reach out for better ideas, for closer connections, and in that a collaborative new way of how companies work with each other. We truly believe we're out of a zero-sum game. And if companies treat procurement higher and treat suppliers higher, then we can come into a new era of really profiting from the source. On the next slide, you briefly see the book we've written where we've combined these ideas, and we'll be very happy to answer any questions now or on LinkedIn. We're very happy for any interaction. We really did this to come into a discussion to move the world a bit forward. And now we're curious about your thoughts.
Thank you very much indeed. There are some really great questions coming in. Thanks everybody for participating. I wanted to dig in, if that's all right, to a very practical question about engaging with suppliers from Brian Mattimore. I'm going to read it all out so you've got a time to just have a think. Do you recommend leading ideation sessions with one supplier at a time, or to ideate with several suppliers at once? We've led both types. Our experience is where there's more than one supplier in the session, it's politically more challenging, but ultimately more effective and innovative. So thank you, Brian. And Christian, Wolfgang, who would like to take that?
I think Wolfgang, this is falling into your camp, right?
Yes, very happy to do so. So indeed, I did my PhD on game theory-based negotiation setups, and this is at the border of a game theory-based setup. Yeah. So I would start with, it depends. In most cases, you're completely right. Let's steer up the field. And if, for example, we don't have a competitor, if we don't have a second supplier, let's just invite a potential one, even though in cases where we're even facing a monopoly. Yes, so exactly, you're right. It's really steering up. The creativity is really bringing a new field. And yeah, in fact, I would like to tell you a personal story. We've been sourcing components for submarines lately, and in that, you can imagine you're in super monopolistic setups. Yeah, and purely by having alternative suppliers, potential alternative suppliers, which everybody factually knew would be super hard to get in. Yeah, because as you can imagine, there's a lot of security restrictions. We were all amazed by how many great ideas were coming in. So you're completely right. In most cases, it makes sense. Now, there might be few selected exceptions where you are on such a close eye-to-eye level, like for example, the Red Bull Rauch story we've just been talking about, that you're actually feeling as friends. Yeah, and I'm located in Stuttgart. There was a time where Daimler and Bosch also were the same way, right? Then Bosch was just so eager to show the new things to Daimler. Yeah, and in these very collaborative, friendship-based discussions, it would be harder to all of a sudden bring in a new face.
Thank you very much. Okay, a more you'll have been in so many situations where we've all kind of understood that procurement is undervalued, and sort of trying to get it higher up the CEO's kind of agenda is difficult. And Amit asks, how do you propose to empower the procurement team? What levers do you pull to give them more kind of credibility and more clarify how valuable they are?
I think this starts with how the CEOs see procurement, right? Even we are telling the story to procurement people, and this is clearly preaching to the converted, right? Now it's up to give procurement a different mandate in the company, and this needs to start from the CEO, and this is also why we address the CEO so much in this book. Let me maybe talk about the root cause, right? So why are we here? So how did we get here? If you think about where CEOs are coming from in terms of education and culture, right? Many of them went through business school, and in business school they will have read finance, marketing, sales, most likely, and they will probably never have heard about procurement. Now, the likelihood is that they made their career in finance, marketing, and sales, and they never really experienced it, right? And at the same time, if you look at movies, novels, so you have the Wolf of Wall Street and so, right? But hardly anything about procurement, so that also doesn't help. So I think we need a mindset change here. And I'm relatively optimistic that the experience of the past 2 years has brought supply chain very, very high up on the agenda of the CEOs, right? I think now this is a really interesting coincidence that our book launched now at this point in time. So I think that this can help, but I think now we need to kick off a wave where this becomes normal, right? Apparently having a good example like Tim Cook and Apple is not sufficient, right? It needs a little bit more.
Good point. We have quite a few questions in the chat and also in the Q&A about the relationship between procurement, which you've outlined really well, and sustainability goals. A more specific one from Liliana Pop here. What's your experience of how procurement drives the energy transition at the moment? A couple of follow-ups. What are the typical problems and solutions for solar power or wind electricity production? Do you see tech and automotive industries taking account of innovation in electricity generation in their procurement? A few ideas there, but I welcome your thoughts.
Yes. Okay. So the first thing is to have transparency. And it's not so hard to get if you leverage the right AI tools, but few companies have been doing it so far. So after getting transparency on where does our CO2 footprint come from, yeah? So maybe we have 100%, yeah, and 77% are coming from suppliers. Which ones of these suppliers are there? Are there suppliers maybe counting up already for 5% of these, yeah, of these 77? Where to pinpoint then the targets, that's the biggest hurdle many companies still are dealing with. And that's, of course, the first task then in order to get going. And then indeed, the levers on the supplier level become quite specific. Sometimes it's about advising on the right energy consumptions. For example, on advising on governmental support on getting the right levers in. For example, on advising on new technologies that suppliers can leverage. For example, on just pushing something through in a negotiation. So first the transparency, and afterwards a clear guidance on the levers. And what we find quite interesting, there's so much focus on sustainability agents and the strategic departments within companies, while we've just seen 70% plus of the sustainability footprint lies in procurement. And we need to invest into the data transparency, and we need to invest into the smart advising of suppliers in order to then really fulfill our goals.
Many thanks. Okay, there's a lot of potential in how we kind of address the procurement function, but also that kind of puts a lot of pressure on as well. There are so many things that procurement could take responsibility for, or certainly be very involved in. And I have a question from GL. GL, what do you think of digital transformation initiatives when procurement needs to work with multiple agendas, including IT and business support function alongside area experts. And this is a big question, but how would an ideal procurement team work so as to unlock new value? I suppose, what are the priorities?
Yeah, I think the digital portion of this question addresses Wolfgang, right? So let's maybe both of us take a shot at this question. I mean, broadly speaking, if you look at suppliers, and Wolfgang showed this 3x3 framework right before, you have the overwhelming majority of your suppliers has very, very low strategic potential. And at the same time, you have probably the overwhelming majority of the procurement people dealing with the suppliers. So now pause here, right? So this means the overwhelming majority of my procurement people is dealing with suppliers that have no strategic potential. And I think the way forward would be, let's try to automate this. And let's move the attention of people from where it doesn't really matter, where we have transactional relationships with suppliers that don't matter, up to the very few suppliers that can make a big difference to our company. And then Wolfgang, maybe want to take the digital angle here.
Exactly. Now, building on what Christian just said, to free up the majority of our people from these redundant tasks, we need smoother system interfaces, and we simply need robots. So if I'm just standing behind these people, they do very redundant and, frankly speaking, not very interesting tasks. And they're quite happy if we take these tasks from them, checking POs, doing follow-up calls on what's exactly to be ordered, doing follow-up calls on where certain materials are. If we would have proper data interfaces, if we would have a clear setup on doing transports of data from one place to another, we would already be fine on that. And at the same time, we need to invest into solutions which help our buyers to be more strategic. For example, the sustainability map. Having a clear pinpoint which supplier is having which CO2 footprint, and maybe having a suggestion, to your point, Sally, this supplier could use from some counseling on governmental subsidies. This supplier should just have some pressure. This supplier maybe just needs to have a new production footprint. In order to have such a guided setup, we need digital solutions on a strategic angle, which oftentimes work with AI, that are accompanied with these robotic solutions. And now, powerful narrative exists. Dear procurement functions, we'll take away your redundant, maybe stubborn tasks and put them into robots, but you have to use the free time for this wider value generation that you get, for example, through AI-based systems.
Thank you. I think we have time for one final question. I'm going to sort of focus on the relationship between procurement and strategy here. And it comes back to your very early slide. Amit asks, how do you differentiate between supporting strategy, you know, so that baseline, and shaping strategy, you know, the aspiration for procurement?
Yeah, okay. Let me answer this in a provocative way. So supporting the strategy would be, okay, you have your product marketing and engineering cook up a product where you know it will fail in the market, but you help them implement it. Or you leverage all the insights you get from your suppliers telling you that that won't fly because your competitors have much better things, and you feed it back to engineering and product marketing and guide them in their choices.
That's brilliant. That kind of wraps it up, I think. Wolfgang, have you got any final comments, or are we good? Then if we're all happy, then I am really pleased to kind of end it at this point. I think that neatly ties up the loose ends. Christian, Wolfgang, thank you so much for your time. Everybody, we will share the recording of this event afterwards, so you can share it with colleagues and view again if you want to see any more points. Thank you very much indeed. All right, have good afternoons.